Thank you, Gemma.
Craig, in your presentation, you outlined the current contribution that nuclear makes and then flagged that during the 2020s, most of the capacity will actually be decommissioned. Should we be worried?
Should we be worried? I think the point I'd make is whatever the ambition is for net zero and climate change targets, is if the current nuclear capacity came off the bars, so that 20% of current electricity, that 40% of low carbon, we're already starting at minus 40 on low carbon. That's the point. That's an awful lot of catching up to do. Now, given the schedule of planned retirements, and there have been some life extensions already for the existing fleet, we know when that capacity is going to come off, and we get the opportunity, I think, to manage that. But because of the lead times for all infrastructure projects, but particularly for new nuclear ones, if we are looking for a like-for-like replacement or some small modular reactors like Allen's, we need to be taking those long-term infrastructure decisions and those long-term investment decisions now and planning to manage that gap. And we've not only got to sort of catch up with the minus 40 or whatever it will be, because obviously we know Hinkley Point's going to come in and take up some of the slack, but we've then got to push beyond that to get to net zero.
That's lovely, thank you. I mean, I think not for you, given your government position, but probably for colleagues to think how we encourage government to make those kinds of decisions. In your presentation, Alan, you talk very much about what you need to do to make the processes far more efficient and the supply chain more efficient. Is there anything, apart from consistency and repetition, are there any other things that you think would help the sector to go further faster?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the supply chain, it all starts with policy. Policy is required to set the background for the market, the market enablement. When the market enablement is there, it's up to us as a tier one supplier to have a competitive product that we can sell and that we can justify to the supply chain a sufficient volume that enables them to invest in the necessary, whether it be capability, capacity, technology development programs. But what the supply chain really need is that forward visibility and certainty of order book. That's what they're continually saying to us, and that's what has been the issue with some of the large reactor programs. There's been that absence of that visibility. When people invest, they get burnt once on this. They won't do it again without having that forward visibility. What we have to do as on the design side is ensure that we actually design a product which is optimised for manufacture, but in optimising it for manufacture, we make it easy for the supply chain to create that volume approach. And an analogy I'll give is if we look in what we've done as Rolls-Royce in the civil aerospace side, historically it used to take us over 100 days to make an engine. We now do them in a fraction of that time. And that's all about the fact that we've had a visible market, we've been able to plan on that basis, and as a result, we've put investment into manufacturing facilities, into capability development and in capacity. And that's where we need to get the nuclear supply chain to the same place.
Great, thank you. We've heard earlier in the day, Tom, about the sector deals, and the nuclear sector deal was one of the early deals. How important is it and why to the sector?
It's the nuclear sector deal is very important to the sector. It's also important, I think, to our ability to be able to move towards that low carbon model for the future. It's effectively about government and industry reinforcing each other, industry taking a much more collaborative approach than perhaps has been in the immediate past, and driving towards some goals that enable what we've all been talking about today and we'll be talking about tomorrow. So it's absolutely very, very important. There's a lot of work going on. It reinforces the points that Alan's just been making and some of the points that Craig made earlier. And when Andy was talking about the potential and the range of people that you have, that you can do this, but you can do, as has been shown in other technologies, the more you do, then the cheaper it is. You learn as you're doing it. You take in innovation. You use the opportunities and abilities that you learn from other sectors and apply them to nuclear. All of those things help us to get to a point where we can get that, what the Committee on Climate Change now call firm power, but the bits that aren't variable output, low carbon generation, that we're going to need to get to that 2050 mix. And, you know, Craig touched on this point about the 20% of our generation and 40% of our low carbon generation. That's on today's demand. Look at future demand.
Yeah.
You know, even with better energy efficiency, demand management, storage, even with all of those things, you look at all of the national grid scenarios going towards 2050, and all of them show that we're going to get anywhere near even the less ambitious decarbonisation targets, then you need much more of our energy coming from electricity and coming from low carbon electricity. That's a challenge not just for nuclear, that's a challenge for nuclear and renewables and all of the associated technologies, but it's a challenge that's also an opportunity if we get it right.
Lovely, thank you. And final question from me before we open it to the floor. You talked about, Andy, the benefits that the industry brings to individuals and to places. I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about what you're doing to attract people into the industry, and tied into Tom's earlier inputs on the sector deal, there's a very clear challenge about gender equality, moving towards 40% of the workforce. Particularly, what are you doing to attract people? Because if we're really honest, today a number of people have observed they've not seen that many women at the front. So it'd be good to understand some of the things that the industry is doing. Andy?
So I think probably break that down into two. So I think to attract people into the industry, I think that has become a lot easier over the last decade as the world is now talking about it. It's stopped being that dirty word that never got through into schools. I remember when my daughter was at school, I offered to go and give a talk on nuclear. The school was like, oof, I don't think that'll go down very well. Now, you know, we are getting schools that want to have that conversation. So that, again, you're getting into a new generation of people who want to be in the industry. And I think, again, we've a long way to go, but we've seen a diverse and more inclusive workforce, especially in the new generation that's coming through. I think, again, you probably looked at a sector that was 25 years ago was probably 95% male, 5% female. I think the sector, and I can only speak for my own business, we are a long way down that track. We're not quite there, but I think there's nothing that we are doing that doesn't allow that. And I went to one of our cadet courses up at Stockton 2 weeks ago, and the room was 50-50. And you know, you can only try to get people to come into the industry. I think that's become a lot easier over the last, say, 5 to 10 years.
That's really heartening. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, just to add a point on this, is on Thursday this week, I'll be in Bristol at a thing called the Young Generation Network, which is young professionals in the nuclear sector. And when you go to their events, and you know, that group of people is much more reflective of society as a whole. It's not just in terms of gender, but wider diversity. The issue that we have, and it's perhaps shared with some other industries, or aspects of the energy industry, is they're not necessarily the people that end up, that at the moment are appearing on these panels, or are the chief executives and chief operating officers of companies. But they're there, and they are, you know, Andy said it before, they're the future. But they're not just, we're not talking about something which is way off into the future. They're the next generation, they're coming through. We need to do a bit more to encourage them to be on these sort of panels and these tables. I'd much rather it wasn't me here, not just because I love coming to Hull, obviously, but that it was somebody who was a different gender here, or from a more diverse background. And, you know, I'm obviously a minority here as being the only southerner. But I think it would be much better if we have more diverse panels, and that's something we need to work at as well.
And it would, and I would say that 50% of my team are female.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And they're not there because that's the number. They're there because they're the right best for the job.
Yeah.
They're the best in the industry. I would put them against anybody. And I think that's not a change. I just think it's become more of a subject now.
Lovely, thank you. Can I open it to the audience for questions? If you can put your hand up and say who you are. Gentleman there.
Rowan Lewis, Hull Friends of the Earth. Just two quick questions, really. One, where does the fuel for your nuclear reactors come from? And 2, where does the waste go to? Thank you.
Right, who would like to start with that one?
Yeah,
You?
So I mentioned a number of challenges up on my slide, but actually if we'd expanded that and talked about not just the public perception angle, but the practical aspects of nuclear power, then looking at the total life cycle, I think, is a perfectly legitimate challenge, and looking particularly at the waste side. A couple of observations. I'm working on what we call advanced nuclear innovation. One of the things we're looking at is whether or not we can reuse material that's already been produced. That would be an extremely efficient thing to do, to extract more energy from material we've already put effort into producing. The nuclear industry is really interesting. It has its own language. When it does this, it talks about reprocessing.
Yeah.
But actually, it's been recycling for years. And actually, one of the really interesting growth areas, I think, going forward is, can we do more genuine recycling and extract more and more energy from material we've already taken out of the ground and started to do things with. On the waste side, there's a live debate at the moment. There's been a recent consultation on a geological disposal facility. I don't think the debate starts and ends with the idea of a hole in the ground. I think it's much more nuanced than that. Again, part of the recycling challenge, I think, is to reduce the volume of waste. It's to look at whether we can change the characteristics of that waste, and whether or not we can reduce the half-life of some of that waste, so that the amount that we have to look after and the amount that subsequent generations need to look after is smaller, safer, and it will last a shorter time. And these are all the areas of research that we're looking at the moment.
Thank you, Craig. Anybody have anything to add on that one? No? No? Thank you.
Kishore Taylor from Humble Lab. Obviously, the nuclear has been included as part of the strategy for the North as an important sector. If you're advising NP11 of one big idea, because we've got to turn the strategy into action, if each of you were asked, what's the one big action the NP11 should pick up, what would that be?
Should we start that end and work this way?
My answer would be to embrace what Alan and Craig was talking about, but to make this the centre of the new small-scale reactor, and actually embrace it with a view that says, you know, you build the capability, that capability then is exportable. But if it's done somewhere else, I will say it's exportable, so it will then come. I think the answer is to own that from the start and actually embrace that, because that will happen.
Andy, thank you. Tom? Oh, you're going to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I think we should be more ambitious than that. I think there's an opportunity here to completely embrace the energy network of the future, clean energy network. And I use the term energy. This isn't about electricity. It's about broader energy. And that includes the proper integration of potentially an SMR plant, the offshore wind industry that's existing here, increased amount of other renewables, and potentially solar, with potential for a hydrogen economy. Properly integrate that into a coordinated energy network, so we optimise around the economics of that as a total system. I think that's a strong ambition. But, you know, I'll just come back to the first question as well. You know, all industries here are doing what we can to decarbonise, and decarbonisation is the big goal at the moment. I think all of the industries, the very fact that mankind is on this planet is a problem, because no matter, when you look at life cycle of anything, you're digging something in the ground or you're throwing something into the atmosphere at some point during that life cycle. Every single industry does it, and probably always will do, because that is the nature of the fact that we need energy. It's not magic. And until somebody invents that magic, which seems a long way off from where I'm sitting, it will always be the case. So we have to do what we can. The other thing I would add about nuclear is, you know, it is the only industry that since its inception has had to deal with its waste before it even builds anything. There's no other industry that does that. Transport industry doesn't, heat industry doesn't. none of the other power generation. So nuclear has already been doing it. Is there more we can do? Yeah, absolutely there is, and Craig outlined some of the things we're doing. I think, for me, this is all about mix, decarbonisation of an energy mix. And if we're going to do something really big in a region, let's look at it in that context and be quite ambitious.
Lovely, thank you, Alan. Tom, back to you. What would you most want MP11 to do?
I was going to say that what you've done today is a pretty good start, actually, because it does two things which you don't always see. Firstly, and I've only skimmed the main report, but just looking at the pull-out bits and the executive summary, you've got all of the different aspects that you need to make the North, which has always been a centre of energy production and a centre of energy industry, the driver for energy in the future, for clean, low-carbon energy in the future. And it isn't done it on one of these approaches which sets one against another. It actually embraces and understands from the very start this is about a system, a massive system change that is happening and is going to continue to happen. And if we're going to get towards and meet that 2050 target, then there's a hell of a lot more that needs to happen, and we've easily done the easy bits already. So I think that's the first thing which you're already doing. The second thing I would say is, what is implicit in this is about the economic opportunity. And there is a massive economic opportunity based on what we already do. Think about what that means in terms of what we know we're going to need and how we're going to do it. And I think the Northern Powerhouse area is fantastically placed. So own that, push that, don't stop doing it, don't get diverted into setting one technology against another. And I think you'll find that the compelling nature of that case will be something that will not just impress people, but will actually elicit action, and the right action from government and industry and others to make it a reality.
Great, Tom. And final word on this one to Craig.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to echo the own it sort of agenda, because the North's played a major role in industrial development throughout the history of the country, including on the nuclear technology. Willing communities, I think, are really important here. It shouldn't be about the government deciding, where things are going to be. We need willing communities. But I continue to innovate, I think, would be my one. We haven't got time to list all of the breakthrough inventions that came from this part of the country, but they continue to do so. And Alan made a really good point, which is the innovation in energy and in decarbonisation is not all about the science and the technology. It's not all about fancy, clever new reactors. It's about some practical things as well, which will bring down risk and time and bring the cost down. And that's where the innovation would be most welcome.
Yeah. Any other questions from anybody?
My question is more related to what happened at the end of the life of the assets. The major challenge, of course, right now we need to deal with decarbonization, climate change, and all of these really difficult topics, and investments is really important. So my question is related to three main areas that need to be really clear for us in 30 years. What are we going to do with these assets? First of all, is right now in the oil and gas sector, because of the fluctuation of oil and gas prices, many of these assets become worn or cold stock. Okay? Decommissioning is one of the major challenges that we are going to face in 30 years, 40 years, accumulated to the level of asset that we have nowadays, that is compromising the money that the government is putting for new investments or going for the route of decommissioning. So my question is, what type of skills, what type of strategies we need to start creating right now to deal with decommissioning in 30 years, not only in this sector, but accumulated to the oil and gas asset that we have in place.
And sorry, you are from?
Elvis from OSL Risk Management.
Thank you. Right, the first thing before we go to the panel is that we've got oodles of expertise here in decommissioning. We are actual world leaders in this particular sector. And I think an interesting spin that we can explore with the panel is how do we share that decommissioning expertise with other sectors, as you've suggested. So, Tom wanted to come in, Craig wanted to come in. Tom?
Well, first thing, we're talking about new reactors. In 30 years' time, they'll only just be getting into, the core part of their generating electricity. So, Hinkley, once it's built, will be generating for at least 60, probably more likely 70 plus years before you get to the decommissioning phase. Second thing is that any new reactors, not only is the decommissioning funded from the start, which is part of the framework, but it's also built into the design of the reactors now. So that is something which is an innovation in the sense that it means that those things are accounted for before anything starts. But on the wider point about the skills and working across sectors, this is already starting to happen, not just with oil and gas that you focused on, but where there are infrastructure that gets the end of its life and then needs to be taken apart and sites activity finished on sites. And there are a lot of common skill sets across those sectors, working in environments where safety is of paramount importance. And the UK industry, as Joe's already said, in terms of decommissioning, has massive capability, which is being used in other parts of the world. In Japan at the moment, a lot of UK companies working in Japan, for example. And in Europe, there will be, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, a whole range of decommissioning opportunities where the UK is well placed. But to maximise that opportunity, what we need to be able to do, I think, is to be able to get an understanding of that skill set and capability, that it's something which is mobile within the UK and further afield and across different sectors. So it's a decommissioning industry rather than a nuclear decommissioning industry and an oil and gas decommissioning industry and other decommissioning industries. And we're starting to do some of that. We do a lot. The NIA does a lot of work with Oil and Gas UK, for example, on those things, and we're sharing a lot of stuff on our skills agenda and skills strategies to work more widely across, because otherwise you end up doing something which is more expensive and more cumbersome than it actually needs to be for no real good reason.
Great, thank you, Tom. And Craig and then Alan.
So I mean, just in nuclear terms, I've been working on nuclear energy for about 10 years now, and my first 5 years of that were almost exclusively on the decommissioning side, working with the NDA and with the NLF and other people who are involved in either funding or developing a strategy and delivering decommissioning plans. So I think the nuclear industry, it's not perfect, it's got a significant legacy to look after, and there's some challenges there, but it has a very well established system, if you like, for considering and looking ahead to future decommissioning challenges. And as Alan and others have said, the nuclear industry is probably one of the few industries where you can't actually start building a new plant without having a very clear plan for decommissioning and for dealing with that. A quick question, really. How many people have got one of these in their pocket? Hands up. How many people own more than one of these? Right. How many people got a drawer full of them at home? Right. Where does your battery go when you throw these things away? There is no worldwide system for recycling the batteries in these things. Actually, at the moment, most of them get burnt, incinerated in countries far, far away from the shores of this country. So we just get rid of them, or they stockpile them. Yeah. So it's a good example of not thinking through the life cycle of a product before you sort of get into it, and it becomes a ubiquitous thing. I think nuclear industry is not perfect, but I think it's at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of planning ahead. But we did talk about maximising our UK's experience here. I actually started life in the first couple of years of my career working on offshore oil and gas, and that was an industry which in the late 80s had only just started to get to grips with the challenges and how it was going to deal with decommissioning. In fact, it got quite a big helping hand from friends in Greenpeace who highlighted some of the shortcomings in the strategy and the plans there. That cycle is going to come round to offshore wind and to some other infrastructure projects at some point. And I would hope that we could rise to the challenge by using the prior experience on oil and gas to help with taking away turbines which have come to the end of their life. And as we generate, as we develop more capacity, it becomes a cycle. It becomes a cycle. It's recycling. And we look after all ends of the cycle, not just the bit we like, the bit we use, but we think about the end use as well.
Yeah, I just echo what Tom and Craig said. Our plan it's got a 60-year operating life as well, and our whole business model pays for the decommissioning over that operational period. That's the way it's the legal requirement in the UK. But what we're also doing is we're designing for decommissioning, which is something quite different. We're actively designing the module construct of the plant and the way we assemble it to be able to disassemble it at the end of those 60 years. It's not necessarily the same as you put it up the way you take it down. My son plays a lot of Lego, and I know that that's true. He doesn't take things apart the same way he puts them together. It's not necessarily the same route. Designing for it is really important because it also allows us to minimise the amount of difficult decommissioning to do and optimise the amount of stuff which is just completely straight away reusable. So design for decommissioning is really important. It is quite interesting though when we have even a very young design team who are designing something which they probably won't be alive to do because it's that long before we will be doing it.
And on that cheery note, any other questions?
John Falk, TV UK. 2 quick points. What size of nuclear material do you think could actually power your whole life? I've been told it's something like about the size of a pea. 1 pea. How much oil do you think you'd need to power your life? How much carbon is pushed out by this? We're killing the planet with this stuff. We always focus on decommissioning, on cleaning up the waste and all that sort of stuff in the nuclear industry. We're the cleanest industry there is. There's hardly any waste at all from the energy we produce. The other piece is, per my comment this morning, let's talk about heat. Let's think about the 50% of the energy that we actually use in the form of heat. Where's it going to come from? There's only one place. These guys in front of you and their colleagues. Any comments?
Who'd like to start with guessing the size of what we need to fuel our life?
I think he's right.
Yeah, well, John knows the answer to his question, but just and he gave you the answer. But the important point, I think, to emphasise is when we're talking about decarbonisation, it's not just about the electricity we currently use. It's about energy use as a whole.
Yeah.
And the distinction between energy and electricity will have to diminish over the next 30 years if we're going to get to a point where we have net zero. So therefore, for every opportunity and technology and enabling facility that enables us to have as low carbon as possible energy system should not just be tolerated, it should be embraced and the opportunities maximised. Because that's
Brilliant.
Good for the economy and it's good for the environment.
Right, final word to Craig and then Andy, because we will close. Craig?
Just very briefly, I mean, one of the consequences of any industry, as Alan said, is it will produce waste. Some energies, carry risk and hazards. Many energies do. Oil and gas, we've seen petrochemicals. I wanted to end on a sort of positive note, which is, for me, when we saw some of the maps of the capability of the north of England and some of the industries that began here and are still here, I see this part of the world as the custodians of much of that, trusted custodians,
absolutely.
Whether that's dealing with next generation hydrogen production, where the northeast might be really well placed to do that. We know your part of the world, Joe, are the custodians of much of the waste, and most of it's being concentrated there, and a lot of the recycling has been done there in the past. So again, back to that earlier question, what would I like to see? Continue to be the responsible custodians that will enable us to make this transformation in the energy system.
Andy, final word to you.
So mine would be on I think the energy mix is important. It's not just one or the other, or it's a several. And the interesting point probably went back to the earlier gentleman's. You know, we've been approached recently to help the oil and gas industry to decommission what is on the North Sea bed, not the bit that you see, the bit that they've left behind because they thought they'd done enough. I think for me it's about each industry's got to learn, and I don't think we can stigmatise one on behalf of another or say one's right. Well, the answer is we need all of it. We've just got to figure out how we make it all be nice in the playground for all of it to exist within the North.
Brilliant. Can I ask everyone to put their hands together for our fabulous panel? Thank you very